The morning of October 11th, 1994, Harold Deering walked his southwest field before the sun had cleared the horizon. He wore the same canvas jacket he'd worn for 19 years, a Carhartt in faded brown with a torn left pocket he'd never gotten around to sewing. The air in Meade County, Kansas that morning was 31 degrees. Frost had settled on the stubble, what little stubble remained, and when he crouched down and pressed 2 fingers into the topsoil, it didn't give the way soil is supposed to give. It compressed like talcum powder, like chalk, like something that had forgotten what it was for. He had 640 acres of this. He pulled his Oakfield tube sampler from his coat pocket, a hand-cranked probe his father had bought second-hand sometime around 1958, and pushed it into the ground at 8 spots across the western quadrant, the way his father had shown him. He didn't need a laboratory to tell him what the numbers were going to say. He'd been watching this ground for 2 years, watching the color drain out of it, watching earthworms disappear from a field where they had once been so thick you couldn't turn a shovelful without finding a dozen. The previous tenant, a corporate lease operation out of Amarillo called Consolidated Plains Agriculture, had worked this section hard from 1984 to 1993, anhydrous ammonia, commercial herbicides, 6-inch tillage 3 times a year. They'd gotten their yields. Then they'd walked away when the lease expired and left Hal with what the agronomist at the Meade County Extension Office later described, in writing, as the most comprehensively depleted soil profile I've observed in 14 years of field assessment in this region. He stood up, put the sampler back in his pocket, and looked west at nothing in particular. A meadowlark was calling from somewhere in the hedgerow along the county road. He listened to it for a moment, then walked back to his truck. The letter from the USDA Farm Service Agency was still sitting on his kitchen table where he'd left it 3 days ago. Harold Eldon Deering had turned 63 that August. He was 6 feet and 1 inch tall, 187 pounds, with hands so weathered that his wife Ruth said they looked like a topographic map of the county they farmed. He'd grown up on this land, literally on it, born in the farmhouse at the north end of Section 14, Township 30 South, Range 28 West, on a Tuesday in August 1931, and he had never lived anywhere else. He turned down a full scholarship to Kansas State in 1969, which most of his neighbors considered a puzzling decision even now, 25 years later. He turned it down because his father needed him, and because Harold Deering did not particularly want to learn farming from a classroom. What most people in Meade County didn't know about Hal was that he had read more about soil science than most county extension agents. Not from textbooks, from journals. Old ones mostly. He had a wooden crate in the corner of his shop, under the workbench where he welded and ground and cut, and in that crate were 31 years of photocopied journal articles, accumulated beginning the year his father handed him a manila envelope and said, "These are the ones worth keeping." His father's name was Vernon Archibald Deering. He died on March 9, 1991, of a heart attack, sitting in the cab of a 1977 John Deere 4430 he'd been driving for 14 years. He was 78 years old. He'd been fixing fence on the eastern boundary of the property when it happened, and the tractor idled in the field for 2 hours before Hal found him. Vernon Deering had farmed 640 acres of dryland wheat in southwestern Kansas for 51 years, through the droughts of the 1950s and the commodity crashes of the 1980s and everything in between, and he had done it largely without the inputs that his neighbors considered essential. His yields were never the highest in the county. He'd never won a yield contest. But his soil, when Vernon died, had an organic matter content of 4.7%, in a region where 2% was considered good. Extension agents came out twice to test it, convinced there was a calibration error. There was no error. The summer before Vernon died, when he and Hal both knew the heart was going, it had been giving warnings for 2 years. He'd taken Hal to the edge of the south field on a June evening and said something that Hal had written down word for word in the small spiral notebook he kept in his shirt pocket. "The ground doesn't need your help," Vernon said. "It needs your patience and your fire. Give it its own shadow and leave it alone." He tapped the soil with the toe of his boot. "The thing you burn isn't gone. It's just changed its form, and the ground knows the difference." Hal had not entirely understood this in 1990. By 1994, standing in a field with 0.4% organic matter, he was beginning to. On October 14, 1994, a gray government Chevy Suburban pulled into Hal's driveway, and Douglas Pritchard stepped out. Pritchard was 49 years old, wearing a pressed khaki shirt with his USDA Farm Service Agency patch on the shoulder, and he had a clipboard under one arm, and the specific kind of confidence that comes from 14 consecutive years of being the person in the room with the most credentials. He was the regional director for the southwestern Kansas district. He supervised 11 county offices and managed, by his own account, the largest portfolio of conservation reserve program enrollment in the state. He shook Hal's hand and looked at the field and said, "You've seen the assessment." "I have," Hal said. "Mr. Deering, I want to be direct with you because I think you deserve that. Your organic matter is at 0.4%. The biological activity is essentially non-existent. You've got mineral substrate, not functional soil. I've got 14 years of field science behind this assessment. You cannot grow wheat in sand." Hal looked at the field. "I didn't ask what I could grow." Pritchard waited. "I asked what I'd owe you," Hal said. Pritchard explained the option the USDA was formally recommending. Enroll all 640 acres in the Conservation Reserve Program. Take the land out of production. Accept the annual government payment, in Hal's case, roughly $47,200 per year, and let the land sit fallow for 10 years, minimum. Let nature begin to correct what a decade of industrial farming had done. At the end of the CRP period, he could reassess. "It's not ideal," Pritchard said. "But the alternative is attempting to farm ground that our modeling indicates cannot produce a viable wheat crop for at least 12 to 15 years. 12 to 15, Hal said, under normal restoration practices, conventional methods." Pritchard handed him a printed summary. "The Extension Office's recommendation is on page 3. Hal held the paper for a moment without looking at it. "I'll think about it," he said. Pritchard nodded and drove away. Hal stood in the driveway and watched the Suburban turn onto the county road and disappear east toward Meade. Then he walked to the south edge of the field and sat on the tailgate of his own truck, a 1988 Ford F-250, 147,000 miles, and looked at the dead-looking ground for a long time. His wife Ruth brought him a cup of coffee at some point and set it next to him without saying anything, and went back inside. He did not file the CRP enrollment paperwork. He also did not tell Pritchard what he was going to do instead. He spent the next 3 weeks in the shop and in the journal crate. He read or reread 11 articles from the stack. The one he kept coming back to was a 1963 paper from the Journal of Soil Science, 15 pages long, by a Kansas State University professor named William J. Sarton. The paper was titled "Carbon Persistence and Biological Reactivation in Degraded Dryland Soils of the Southern High Plains." Hal had photocopied it in 1987 from the University Library in Manhattan. He had read it twice before and found it interesting but impractical. Now he read it 4 more times and found it essential. Sarton's argument was simple but ran against virtually everything the Green Revolution had established. Pyrogenic carbon, What farmers once called char, applied to severely depleted soils, did not merely add organic material. It restructured the cation exchange capacity of the mineral profile, creating what Sarton called biological scaffolding, a porous, stable substrate that could hold water and microbial life even in soil that had been chemically stripped nearly to zero. The key condition Sarton identified was counterintuitive. The more depleted the soil, the more receptive it was to biochar application, because there was no competing organic chemistry to interfere with the absorption. Dead ground, Sarton wrote, is not ruined ground. It is merely empty. Hal found Sarton's phone number through the Kansas State Alumni Directory. He called on a Wednesday evening in November. William Sarton was 76 years old by then and living in Salina, Kansas. He had retired from K-State in 1985 and had not, he said, been contacted about his 1963 paper in approximately 20 years. He listened to Hal describe the field, the organic matter content, the compaction profile, the biological activity data, and was quiet for a long moment. "What are you thinking of doing?" Sarton said. Hal told him. Another long pause, then, "The USDA will tell you it can't work." "They already have," Hal said. "They're wrong," Sarton said. "But it'll take you 4 years before you can prove it, maybe 5. Are you prepared for that?" Hal said he was. "The char has to come from your own crop residue," Sarton said. "Not commercial biochar. It has to match the mineral profile of the ground you're trying to heal. Your father would have understood that." Hal had not mentioned his father. "Every old dryland farmer in this county understood it," Sarton said. "They just called it something different." He did not tell Gene Kowalski what he was planning, but Gene figured out most of it on his own. Gene farmed the adjacent section, Section 15, directly to the east, and he and Hal shared a fence line 1,320 feet long, which meant they saw each other more often than either of them probably would have chosen. Gene was 57, a good farmer by the county's standards, yield-focused, practical, skeptical of anything that didn't come with a university extension pamphlet to back it up. He watched Hal haul 2 500-gallon propane tanks into his shop in December of 1994, and watched him spend 8 weeks cutting and welding and grinding on them, and said nothing until March of 1995, when the first of the 2 modified kilns came out of the shop, and Hal towed it to the south field with his tractor. "What is that?" Gene said. It wasn't really a question. "Biochar kiln," Hal said. Gene walked around it. It was a horizontal cylindrical unit, the propane tank mounted on a steel pipe frame with a firebox at one end and a chimney flue offset at a 15-degree angle, designed for low oxygen combustion, to pyrolyze crop residue into stable carbon rather than burning it to ash. Hal had built it to Sarton's specifications, modified from a diagram in a 1947 agricultural engineering manual he'd found at a used bookstore in Liberal, Kansas. "You're going to make charcoal," Gene said. "Biochar," Hal said, "and put it in that ground." "Yes." Gene looked at the dead field. "Hal, you're burying good charcoal in dead ground. That's the saddest thing I've ever seen a grown man do." Hal pulled on his welding gloves. "Maybe so." He started the first burn that afternoon. By the end of April 1995, he had processed 11 tons of wheat straw and milo stalks from his 1994 harvest residue. The char went into his father's old International grain wagon, and Hal drove it across the field in parallel passes, 2 tons per acre on the western 80 acres, his test plot. He worked it into a depth of 4 inches with a 1959 case disc harrow he'd bought at a farm auction in Liberal for $340. Then he planted his first cover crop mix: hairy vetch, crimson clover, tillage radish, and winter rye. He used his 1978 John Deere 7000 6-row planter, which had been his father's. He calibrated the seed rate by hand twice. He did not plant a single acre of wheat that fall. The county took notice of this. Spring 1996. He processed the cover crops. He ran the crimson clover and vetch into the ground with the disc, let it decompose for 6 weeks, then applied another 1.8 tons of biochar per acre to the test plot and a first application to the eastern 160 acres. He had the second kiln operational by June. He planted a second cover crop cycle, this time adding Austrian winter peas to the mix. Gene Kowalski drove by the field on a Tuesday in July of 1996 and stopped on the road and watched Hal working the second kiln alone in the August heat. Gene sat in his truck for several minutes. Then he drove away without saying anything. In August of 1996, the USDA sent a form letter reminding Hal that the CRP enrollment window was still open and that the deadline for the current fiscal cycle was September 30th. Hal folded the letter and put it in the crate in the shop. Fall 1996. Hal sent soil samples to the Kansas State Extension Laboratory in Manhattan. He used his father's Oakfield probe and took 24 samples from the test plot, following the grid pattern Vernon had shown him, 4 rows of 6, 20 feet apart. He drove the samples to the UPS office in Meade on a Thursday morning and did not tell anyone what he was expecting. The results came back 11 days later. Organic matter on the test plot, 0.9%. Up from 0.4%. A 125% increase in 20 months. Microbial activity had increased by a factor of 6. The cation exchange capacity had improved from 4.2 milliequivalents per 100 grams to 11.7. He looked at the numbers at the kitchen table. Ruth was washing dishes. He didn't say anything for a while. Soil came back better than I thought, he finally said. How much better, she said. A lot, he said. Spring 1997. He expanded the biochar application to the full 640 acres and completed his third cover crop cycle. He hired no one. He did not consult the extension office. He drove the John Deere planter himself, alone, from 5 in the morning until dark, for 9 days. He lost 6 pounds during that stretch, and Ruth made him sit down for dinner every evening even when he didn't want to. A representative from the Meade County Extension Office, a young man named Derek Flatt, 28 years old, 2 years out of K-State, stopped by in May to follow up on an inquiry Hal had never made. He walked the field and looked at the cover crop stand and said the growth looked adequate but not exceptional. He noted the lack of commercial fertilizer and the absence of a weed control program and said he had some concerns. He left a stack of printed guides on cover crop management. Hal thanked him and set the guides on the workbench. September 1997. Soil samples again. The test plot, now in its third year, read 1.8% organic matter. The rest of the field, in its second year of treatment, read between 0.8 and 1.1%. Earthworms had returned. Hal counted 11 per cubic foot in the test plot. His father's field in its best years had run 14. He made a note of this in the spiral notebook. Fall 1997. He planted wheat on the test plot for the first time, 80 acres. He used a seed rate his father had used, 90 pounds per acre, a rate modern agronomists considered conservative to the point of eccentric. He planted on October 3rd and waited. The crop emerged, thin at first, then thicker than it had any right to be. Gene Kowalski drove past in early November and slowed his truck and looked at the green for a long time. He didn't stop. Spring 1998. The legal matter resolved itself, which was not the point of any of this but was not unwelcome. Consolidated Plains Agriculture had filed for bankruptcy protection in 1995, and a civil suit Hal had filed against them in Meade County District Court in 1994 for breach of lease terms regarding soil stewardship. Settled in February 1998, for $112,000. Hal used $71,000 of it to purchase a used 1993 case, IH 7120 combine, he'd been watching at a dealer in Liberal, replacing his aging 1983 model. He used the remaining $41,000 to buy seed, fuel, and biochar kiln materials for the final full-field treatment cycle. He did not deposit the money as a victory. He deposited it as materials. The wheat came off the test plot in July of 1999. Harold Deering climbed into the cab of the case IH 7120 on the morning of July 8th at 6:47 in the morning, and started cutting 80 acres of wheat on ground that Douglas Pritchard had told him was biologically dead 5 years before. The yield monitor on the combine read consistently through the morning. He dumped 3 times into the grain cart before noon. Ruth brought lunch to the field at 12:30 and sat in the cab with him while he ate, and neither of them said much, and she looked at the numbers on the monitor and looked at the standing wheat and went back to the house. He finished the plot by 4 in the afternoon. He sat in the cab for a while after the last pass with the engine off. When he had the final tally calculated through the elevator tickets from the Mead Co-op, where he delivered 4 loads on July 9th, the number came to 44.3 bushels per acre. The Meade County average for winter wheat in 1999 was 28.7 bushels per acre. The USDA's 15-year projection for the field, using conventional restoration methods, had been 18 to 22 bushels per acre in year 15. He was in year 5. He called Dr. Sartain from the phone in the kitchen that evening. Sartain picked up on the 3rd ring. 44 bushels, Hal said, a very long silence. Then Sartain said, "What was the rest of the county doing?" 28.7. Another pause. Hal could hear Sartain breathing. "Then, your father would have said about time." Hal almost smiled. He would have said about time either way. He hung up the phone and went to bed at 9:30. He had filmed the harvest with a borrowed Sony Handycam that his nephew had driven out from Liberal. He hadn't planned to film it. His nephew, Jason, had brought the camera to record a different project entirely, and had on impulse turned it toward the combine as it made its first pass through the test plot on the morning of July 8th. He filmed for 30 minutes. The footage was amateur and badly lit in places, and caught Hal at one point stepping out of the combine cab, crouching in the wheat stubble, and picking up a handful of soil, and looking at it for a long time without saying anything. Jason Deering sent copies of the tape to 3 people his uncle had mentioned: Dr. William Sartain at his home in Salina, the Meade County Extension Office, and the Regional Office of Kansas State University's Agricultural Research Division in Garden City. Word doesn't travel by newspaper in farming country. It travels by telephone and by coffee at the co-op elevator, and by men leaning on fence rails at the edge of fields. By August of 1999, people in Meade County who cared about such things had heard that Hal Deering had gotten 44 bushels off the dead section. Most of them heard it as 40 bushels because numbers travel imprecisely. A few heard it as 50. None of them believed any version of it. Gene Kowalski came by in the second week of August. He drove his truck into the driveway and got out without being invited, which was not unusual, and walked directly to the field boundary and looked at the stubble. He crouched down the way Hal had on the tape. He had not seen the tape, and pressed his fingers into the soil and held them there. He stood up. He looked at Hal, who was standing by the shop door. "That's real soil," Gene said. "Yes," Hal said. Gene looked at the field again. He rubbed the dirt off his fingers on his jeans. "I shouldn't have said what I said about the charcoal." "You weren't wrong to say it," Hal said. Gene didn't answer that. He got back in his truck and drove home. In September of 1999, Dr. Ross N. Hutchins, an associate professor of soil biochemistry at Kansas State University's Southwest Research Extension Center in Garden City, drove to Meade County and spent 2 days taking soil samples from Hal's field. Her preliminary report, submitted in November to the K-State Extension publication Soil Management Update, documented organic matter content across the full 640 acres, averaging 2.6%, with the original test plot at 3.2%, up from a baseline of 0.4% in 1994. The report noted that Sarton's 1963 paper had predicted results consistent with what Deering had achieved, and that the methodology represented a significant and underutilized approach to dryland soil restoration in the southern high plains. The report recommended formal replication studies. It was the first time William Sarton's 1963 paper had been cited in a K-State publication in 27 years. Hal did not change his routine. Douglas Pritchard arrived on a Thursday morning in late April of 2000 without calling ahead. He drove a different government vehicle now, a white Ford Expedition, and he was alone. He didn't bring a clipboard. He knocked on the front door of the farmhouse and Ruth answered and showed him to the kitchen table, and he sat down and accepted the coffee she offered and waited for Hal to come in from the shop. Hal came in at 8:15, still wearing his welding gloves, and sat across the table from Pritchard and looked at him. Pritchard was quiet for a moment. He looked at his coffee cup. "I wrote the wrong number on that assessment," Pritchard said. "I wrote 0.4% and said it was a conclusion. It was a measurement, a snapshot. I didn't account for what could happen if the approach was completely different from anything in our models." He paused. "I should have asked you what you were planning to do." Hal said nothing. "I've read the K-State report," Pritchard said. "I've had 2 of our soil scientists look at Dr. Hutchins's data. They agree with her findings." He set his coffee down. The USDA's Regional Soil Restoration Program were dealing with 14 other sections across southwestern Kansas that were enrolled in CRP after similar degradation assessments. Some of them have been sitting fallow for 8 years, and the recovery is not what we projected. Not even close. He looked up. "I want to know if what you did here can work there." Hal looked at his welding gloves. He pulled them off and set them on the table. "The char has to come from the site's own residue," Hal said, "or adjacent fields with the same mineral profile. Commercial biochar won't give you the same result. You need a low-oxygen kiln. I can show you the design I used. And you need to leave it alone. No tillage for 3 seasons. That's the part that's going to be hard for you." "Why hard for us?" "Because your program is built around demonstrating annual progress," Hal said. 3 years of sitting still doesn't look like progress in a report." Pritchard was quiet for a moment. "Can we bring some people out here? Our soil scientists and maybe some of the other farmers whose land is enrolled." "You can bring them," Hal said. Pritchard stood and picked up his hat from the table and then set it back down. "Mr. Deering, Hal," he looked at him directly. "I'm sorry I dismissed you. I had the title and the assessment and the models, and I used all of them instead of listening to what you knew. That was wrong." Hal looked at him for a moment. "I know what it costs a man to say that," Hal finally said. "I appreciate it." He walked Pritchard to the door. He stood on the porch and watched the white Expedition back down the driveway and turn east on the county road. Then he picked up his welding gloves from where he'd left them on the porch rail and went back to the shop. The field day happened on June 14, 2000. Hal had not organized it. Pritchard's office had organized it, in coordination with Dr. Hutchins at K-State and the Southwest Kansas Farm Bureau. 47 people came. Farmers mostly. A few soil scientists. 2 extension agents. A reporter from the Dodge City Daily Globe who took photographs but didn't write a story for 3 weeks, by which time people had already stopped needing to read it. By the end of 2000, 11 of the 14 CRP-enrolled sections that Pritchard had referenced were piloting modified versions of Hal's method, adapted to their specific soil profiles with Dr. Hutchins's guidance. Hal drove to 3 of them personally, one in Haskell County, one in Stevens County, one just across the border in Beaver County, Oklahoma, and walked the ground with the farmers and answered questions for as long as anyone had them. By 2002, 4 of the 11 pilot sections had registered measurable organic matter improvements ranging from 0.3 to 0.8 percentage points, modest in absolute terms, transformative in context. The Beaver County, Oklahoma section, farmed by a 61-year-old man named Leonard Prout, had gone from 0.5% organic matter to 1.4% in 22 months, the fastest documented recovery rate in any of the pilot sites. Leonard Prout credited Hal Deering. Hal told him to credit his own patience. Douglas Pritchard testified before the Kansas Senate Agriculture Committee in March of 2002 regarding proposed modifications to the state's CRP management guidelines. He brought Dr. Hutchins's report and a summary of the pilot program results. He also said, on the record, in front of 11 state senators, that the original assessment of Harold Deering's Section 14 had been technically accurate but practically insufficient, and that the USDA's models at the time did not account for methodologies that fell outside our established frameworks. Mr. Deering knew something we didn't have a category for, and the land proved it. No one in the room had ever heard a USDA regional director say something like that in legislative testimony. William Sartin's 1963 paper was formally republished in the revised edition of the Journal of Dryland Agriculture in the spring of 2003, 40 years after it first appeared. The editor's note cited renewed relevance in light of recent field applications in southwestern Kansas. Sartin was 85 years old and living in a senior care facility in Salina by then. Hal drove up to see him in April with a copy of the journal and sat with him in his room for 2 hours. Sartin held the journal and ran his thumb along the cover and said, "Better late than right." Hal laughed. It was the most genuine laugh anyone in Meade County had heard from him in years. In 2004, a documentary crew from the Kansas Ag Network spent 4 days on the farm filming Hal's operation. It was a modest production, 3 people, a Sony broadcast camera, and a budget that didn't include a soundman. So the audio captured wind and grain noise and the sound of the case IH-7120 at work and Hal's voice, which was low and unhurried, and exactly what it needed to be. The footage of Hal crouching in the field, pressing his fingers into the soil and looking at it the way a doctor reads a patient's face, became the most shared clip from the documentary. Farmers from Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Colorado drove to Meade County in the summer and fall of 2004 to see the field. The county road in front of Section 14 saw more traffic in those months than it had in the preceding decade. Hal answered every question. He showed anyone who asked how to build the kilns. He walked people across the field and let them pull soil from the ground and hold it. He did not sell anything. He did not charge for his time. On the morning of October 3, 2004, 10 years to the week from the first biochar burn, Harold Deering walked his southwest field before the sun had cleared the horizon. He wore the same canvas jacket. He'd finally sewn the left pocket sometime around 2001. The stitching wasn't perfect, but it held. The soil was different in a way that wouldn't show in a photograph. You had to press your fingers into it to understand. He did this now, crouched at the edge of the field, 2 fingers into the top inch, the way his father had taught him and his father's father had taught his father. The soil gave. It compressed and released, dark and slightly moist and alive with the particular smell of active ground, something between rain and wood and iron. He held his fingers to his nose for a moment, the way he'd seen Vernon do 1,000 times. He stood up and looked across 640 acres of wheat stubble from the July harvest. The field that Douglas Pritchard had said was biologically dead. The field that the USDA's models had given 12 to 15 years to produce a viable crop. It had just come off its 5th consecutive wheat harvest at above-county average yields. Last July's yield, 47.1 bushels per acre. The county average, 31.2. He heard Ruth's boots on the gravel behind him. She came and stood next to him without saying anything, the way she always did. "You going to the Prout field next week?" she said. "Tuesday," he said. She looked at the field with him. After a while she said, "Your dad walked this field every morning." "He did," Hal said. "Same way you do," Hal nodded. "Same reason, I think," he said. He pulled the old Oakfield probe from his jacket pocket, the one his father had bought second-hand in 1958, the one that had taken the first desperate samples in this very field in the cold October of 1994. He turned it in his hand once and slid it back into his pocket. The meadowlark was calling from the hedgerow again. Or one that looked like the same one. He'd come to understand in the years since the first burn that what the land had needed from him was not intervention but attention. Not rescue but patience. The soil had not been ruined by the decade of industrial farming. It had been emptied. And empty, he had learned from his father and from Sartain and from the ground itself, is not the same thing as broken. Empty can be filled. Empty, in fact, can be filled more readily than ground that is merely half alive. The problem had been the solution. The very condition that Pritchard's assessment had described as proof of impossibility, the stripped mineral substrate, the near-zero organic matter, had made the soil maximally receptive to biochar absorption. The deadness was the door. He stood there for a while longer in the October cold. Then he walked back to his truck and started the day's work.